The Apostle Paul was not someone who was unfamiliar with suffering. He never hid that fact. You can read through the book of Acts and how he writes in his epistles, where he comes out openly about everything that he's struggled and faced with while serving God and being a minister of the gospel. And in 2 Corinthians, he spends a lot of time talking about some things he's suffering. And the main conflict that he discusses, especially in the second half of the letter, is this new threat of false teachers who have slipped into the Corinthian church. Men who Paul has dubbed super apostles. Men who pretend they are servants of God but are truly serving themselves. Men who speak with grandeur, who look like prominent men, who speak with elegant speech and seem like they know what they're talking about, but really they're leading the Corinthian people on a path to destruction. And they're leading the Corinthian people to slander against Paul. See him as someone who is actually weak, someone who is not worthwhile listening to. So Paul finds himself having to defend his integrity as an apostle, but he's not boasting about all the great things he's done. He's not boasting about himself being a great speaker. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and in verse 30, Paul says this, "If I have to boast, I will boast of what pertains to my weakness." Something that set Paul apart from these super apostles, is that he's not boasting in his strengths, but in his weaknesses. And this is something that he had to learn, that was taught to him. In chapter 12 and verse 7, he writes this to the Corinthians: "Because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Paul says he was given a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, a vague term to describe some suffering that he was having to deal with, something that was causing him pain and anguish, and that he prayed to God to remove from him. He prayed 3 times that this thorn might be removed from his flesh, and God said, "No, I'm not going to remove it because it serves a purpose." He says, "My grace is sufficient for you. I've already delivered you from the greatest suffering." And he says, "My power is perfected in weakness." That's the lesson that Paul needed to learn. He was learning humility. He was learning to rely on God's power. And he learned what the purpose of his suffering was. His purpose in suffering was to glorify God and not himself. Even in Paul's suffering, he can glorify God. Do we ever consider that our suffering, our affliction, can be used for God's glory and forwarding the work of the kingdom? That's what Paul saw. And that's why he could say that gladly he would rather boast about his weaknesses, that he would be content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, and with difficulties for Christ's sake. Paul said, everything I faced up until this point, all the struggles I faced for Christ's sake, and everything I will face for Christ's sake, I'm okay with that. I am content with that. Why? Because that glorifies God. Paul says, I am a weak man, and that's okay, because God can still do great things through me. Only an almighty, great, all-powerful God can do great, incredible things with weak, flawed individuals like Paul and like us. So when we're faced with suffering and afflictions in this life, look at what we can learn from it. See how that can become opportunities to serve God. Remember, everyone in the Bible, every single character, every single hero of faith, we might call them, have their weaknesses, their flaws, their afflictions that God used to further his purpose, and he could do the same with you. God can do great things through your talents, through your strengths, and even through your weaknesses. So reflect on those thoughts throughout this week, throughout your life, and look at all the many ways in both your highs and lows in life that you can glorify God.
We began this evening by reading through Psalm chapter, or the 34th Psalm, rather, and we read this truth that is, the righteous person will have many troubles. Then Jordan led us in considering what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. And that's a realization Paul arrived at after receiving this thorn in the flesh, after receiving this really terrible suffering and pain. It reminds me of something I heard Mike say not long after I got here, which is he was quoting C.S. Lewis when he said, "Suffering is God's megaphone to humanity." God speaks to us in a lot of ways, but he uses suffering to remind us to rely on him and that we are weak apart from our God. You know, all over the Bible, we see that God is reminding us of this truth, and even that he uses suffering to strengthen our character through suffering as well. We saw also that more than all this, Jesus, he suffered for us and is an example for us. And he leads the way and even supports us and protects us as we walk through this life. Even though we have received lots of blessings while we go through this crooked world, we are definitely and certainly eagerly waiting for the full blessings to come from God, for Christ to come and take us home. And that's one of the points in Romans 8 that we just read. And that right now, we've received lots of blessings. We're also waiting for the completion of those blessings. In Romans 8, Paul said, creation's groaning in the pains of childbirth, but he brought that up because he says, that's like what we're going through. We likewise groan as we wait for our full redemption. Has anyone here ever given birth to a baby? Was it a fun experience? Would you say it was enjoyable? No, those are kind of the wrong terms for that question, right? Because you think about that experience, and it wasn't enjoyable. You wouldn't describe it that way. But you would never take back delivering your baby. And that's what Paul's saying here. Like right now, we groan, we suffer intensely. But he also says, and this is in Romans 8, verse 18, he says, and he's not making light of anyone's suffering. He says that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory in store for us. Suffering's real, suffering's hard, but God's glory is going to be so much more than what we experience now. And that picture of a mother being just delighted when her baby arrives is perfect for that. Even though Paul suffered intensely, he could not be more confident of the victory that he has in Jesus, the unshakable foundation that he stands on, which is God's promise, the victory of Jesus. And we also have that. The confidence that Paul has, we have every cause to share in that confidence. This idea of suffering for a little while before amazing blessings is something we see all over the Bible. And sometimes it's even with the same picture that we saw in Romans chapter 8, pains in childbirth before the joy of a new life. But Genesis chapter 3 is the first place we read about pains in childbirth. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, God tells Eve that she will experience great pain in childbearing. That's certainly something that was important for Eve to hear. But it's an idea that's developed all over the Bible. The prophets use it as a picture of God's people experiencing great suffering. Then later in the New Testament, like in Romans 8 or in John, we see that picture used in the way of a little suffering and then unmeasurable joy. And so, in that way, it's appropriate that Genesis 15 is right before it and says this, that there will be enmity, hatred between your seed and the woman's seed. He's talking about Satan and Eve. He will crush your head, you'll only bite his heel. And these two pictures are sort of illustrating the same point, because the way Paul uses it in Romans 8 is pain in childbirth for a little while for the joy of a new life. And there in Genesis chapter 3, it's a heel bite before a decisive head crush. And you know, one of those is a whole lot more decisive than the other one. If something bites my heel, that's bad news. I'm not going to enjoy that. But if something shatters my skull, I'm not going to recover from that. That's decisive. The sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that Jesus has promised us. He will defeat all evil. He will bring us home. He will wipe away every tear. We will be comforted. We will be completed in Jesus. I want to read a couple verses from John chapter 11, just a few here. John chapter 11, if you'd like to listen or turn over there. And I'll start reading here in verse 1. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany. Bethany was the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who had anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, and it was her brother Lazarus who was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it's for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So, when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. And we'll go ahead and stop there. Mary and Martha have a huge problem. They're terrified that their brother is going to die because he's in the grip of this horrible sickness. And so these sisters send a message to Jesus and they beg him to leave right at once and go and heal their brother. And in John 11, verse 5, we read, Jesus loved Martha and Mary and Lazarus. And so he stayed where he was for 2 days. That doesn't seem like it matches up the first time I read it. And later, a couple verses later, he's going to tell his disciples, For your sake, I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. Jesus says, I'm glad I wasn't there. I'm glad I didn't heal Lazarus. It's sort of like saying he's glad that Lazarus died. Why would Jesus say something like that? After he waits 2 days, he goes to Mary and Martha, and he raises their brother from the dead. Lazarus was dead, and now he's alive. And that is not something they thought he could do. They thought Jesus could heal Lazarus, but they did not know he could raise him from the dead. And so it's through this experience that they learn more about the greatness and the goodness of God. And it's because Jesus did not rescue their brother in the way that they imagined. Verse 4, remember? Lazarus has this sickness, but it won't lead to death. Instead, it's for the glory of God that the Son of Man might be glorified through it. Jesus is interested in gaining glory. But it's not like he's hoarding this from himself, or for himself, rather. Whenever Jesus gains glory, that means good things for his people, because he's generous, and he shares, and he supports the people who rely on him. This experience that Mary and Martha are going through is a really intense refining process. Jesus is proving himself here to be a master blacksmith. He's strengthening and he's sharpening Mary and Martha and even his disciples. They wouldn't have described this as enjoyable, definitely not, but it was good for them. They learn more about who Jesus is through this experience. Lazarus' sickness and death meant a lot of suffering for these sisters, but it did not end in death. Before I wrap up, I do want to share some of my own experiences here, and I just want to be totally clear. I'm not sharing this because I think my suffering is worse than yours or anything like that. This is just the suffering I'm best equipped to talk about. And I know, even in the short time I've been here, I know that a lot of you have experienced very great suffering and terrible grief, even recently. And my heart goes out to you. It was 5 years ago. Mike mentioned this when, right before my first sermon was introducing me to you all. But 5 years ago, my dad suddenly and shockingly passed away while we were on vacation in the Virgin Islands. He was just out doing a little snorkeling. Me and my brother were on the beach, and don't know exactly what happened, but he drowned, even while my brother and I were maybe like 30 feet away or something like that. That was shocking. That was terrible. That was not fun or enjoyable. But I can honestly say that I realized a ton about God's love through that experience. I can't prove that's why he did that, but that's one of the good things that he brought about through that suffering. It'd be useless to engage in a hypothetical like my life is better, like I'm a better Christian because of this than if my dad hadn't passed away. But I do know for certain that I have grown. And I have grown to rely more and more on Jesus through this experience. Is that uncomfortable blacksmith refining process. I'll just mention one other thing here, and I'll wrap up. More recently, I was living with a man who was suffering from a really intense disease, is ALS. And I had so much respect for him and grew to respect him a lot watching him go through that because I was with him for a year, and so day after day I saw him get whittled away more and more, becoming weaker and weaker until he's completely immobile and couldn't even speak. And so just constantly seeing that made me ask God, why are you doing this to this guy? But when I talked to this man, he praised God. And he said many times that he was being refined by this and was growing through that. And even if that hadn't been true, I learned a lot from him during that time. And I wasn't the only one who learned a lot through his suffering. We're in the middle of Psalms. We just finished reading through Job not too long ago. Job never got an answer for why he was suffering, except that God said he was in control. And God told Job he had to trust him. We probably aren't going to get a specific explanation for why we go through any kind of suffering, but we can be certain, and I mean totally certain, that God will bring about good through it. It will be worth it. It will be worth it. There's purpose in whatever suffering you're going through and whatever suffering you will go through or have gone through. It's like this. It's every time I lost my slides here. But every time God operates like this, we see there's a heel bite before a head crush, and it's birth pains before a new life, and it's cross before the crown, like Jesus showed us. And 2 Corinthians 4 says it's, I think, the best anyone can say it, which is, for this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Amen to that. Even in the very beginning, it was darkness before it was light. This is how God does things, and we can trust him to do it well. We need to praise him for that. If you need the prayers of the congregation, if you want to make this amazing God your God, put him on in baptism. If we can pray for you or help you in any way, then come forward as we stand and sing this song.